Rise up! Team rise!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. It's episode 322, following the cuts to the roster, so the Arizona Cardinals now have a regular roster. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from the USA Today NFL Wire, with my co-host Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, which is the Arizona Cardinals site from SB Nation, and he's also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast. As things are going to get interesting there, I'm sure, with the college season now just getting started. But Seth, we are now done with the preseason. But it was weird because they didn't have a final preseason game. I guess we can kind of start with that. Is like, how weird was this weekend? And to all those people who live in the New Orleans area, we wish you health and hope in getting things cleaned up. But what a weird weekend that, the Cardinals go from having a game in New Orleans to they move the kickoff up, 7 hours, and then the Cardinals get on the plane to go to New Orleans. And some point during their flight, the Saints cancel the game and the Cardinals have to turn around and come home. So they pack their bags, they get on the flight, they fly almost there and have to fly all the way back. What a weird weekend, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was odd. And, obviously, like you said, the most important thing is the health and safety of everybody in Louisiana. That's really what matters. When you look at it, it sucked, first off, that you were excited about, hey, the game moved up. Like, you and I are...
The Saturday night. We have Saturday night again.
Right. Like, you and I are family guys. We were thinking to ourselves, oh, man, we're going to have a Saturday night. Then, 2 hours later, the game's called, and you go, okay, well, now I have to figure out what's going on.
Right, I have a whole Saturday, but now I don't have the excuse to not do the other things I kind of need to do, but didn't have to do. Yeah.
Right. So,
there's one thing that was a positive out of the fact, other than the fact it was the right thing to do, is that one of the things that complicates roster decisions is injuries. And so the Cardinals didn't end up having, they didn't add anyone getting hurt in that final preseason game where you have to IR someone or waive injure them or keep them on the roster and have them holding a roster spot while they can't play. They were able to, avoid any further injuries on the roster.
Yeah, and that was, I think, especially, you look at the two big ones, obviously, Travis Etienne, the rookie, hopefully rookie phenom from Jacksonville,
that was
Liz Frank injury.
That's devastating.
And then J.K. Dobbins blows a knee out. And again, two just young, dynamic running backs just in doing nothing. And that's the reality of it. And so when you look at it, you go, feel really bad for those guys because phenomenal players, great guys. Let's get out of this, right? Like, let's get out of this healthy. And they did. And like I said, it sucks, man. Like, you feel awful for those two guys, especially. But at the end of the day, as Cardinals fans, we want to see the Cardinals healthy and on the field, and we're going to be able to do that now. And that's kind of where we leave off, because at the end of the day, that's, while we still do care about, the health of everybody, those aren't the guys that we're cheering for and rooting for the Arizona Cardinals. And that's why we look at it and go, hey, maybe, that last preseason game spared an Eno Benjamin or Andy Isabella or whoever, you just go down the list of guys and you say they didn't get hurt. and that matters way more than, you know, a third preseason game where what I was going to say maybe at least 50% of the starters weren't going to play.
Right, absolutely. They probably weren't going to play hardly, unless, with the exception of the guys who needed to get some work in, who weren't like your stars. Yeah, it was that. So this edition of the show, we're in 322, is more about the cuts to the roster, as the Cardinals have the final 53, where it currently stands at 52 players in the practice squad. We're going to go through each position, discuss the surprises to the cuts, the ones who stayed, the reactions, and we'll do that both on offensive, defense. We do have some discussion, particularly about the cornerback position, because of Malcolm Butler, who is shockingly retired right now, out of the blue. And we'll look at that at the cornerback position, the situation with Butler, and other positional concerns we have. So let's go ahead and get started. The Cardinals got down to their final cuts, got it down to 52 players with 2 players still, Justin Pugh and Robert Alford, on the COVID list. That leads us, let's start with the quarterbacks. They have 3 on the final roster: Kyler Murray, Colton McCoy, and Chris Streveler. Any surprise in terms of having all 3 of those players at the position?
No, I think the only surprise is that I got the quarterbacks right and you got the running backs right, and they kept 7 of those guys right.
Yes, and that's one of the things. So I'm not completely surprised. I'm not blown away by it, because I understand why having a third quarterback on the active roster makes sense.
And I don't know if you wrote about it on Twitter. I thought I saw you mention it somewhere, but with 1, Streveler's progression, and then 2, still the COVID situation, you basically want to have more ready to go than not, because you're not just talking about your starter, you're also talking about your main backup. And so in the sense of, at any time you could lose one of those guys. I mean, I know we'll talk about it as it gets a little closer, but I mean, Tennessee right now is scheduled to start Logan Woodside at quarterback, because Ryan Tannehill's in COVID protocol. So, I mean, if you don't have Streveler on the active roster, you cannot predict if he makes it through waiver claims. And if he gets claimed, it's not so much that you can't find somebody, it's that you're going to be picking up a Drew Anderson or I'm trying to think of the names that have been in at quarterback during the preseason for the Cardinals the last couple of years, like
Phillip Sims, just those Trevor, what's his name, that was out of Texas A&M. What was that kid? I can't remember.
Oh yeah, I remember who you're talking about. Like, yeah, and so exactly, like keeping Streveler basically gives you're probably only going to have 2 quarterbacks active on game days, but it gives you the peace of mind if, God forbid, anything happens during the week.
Right, and I'll tell you, as much as Cardinals fans dislike Chris Streveler for how things finished, the organization really likes him. They like his athleticism and his arm, and the fact that he can do some of the things, which is kind of one of the things that they liked about Brett Hundley when they had him, is because he can do some of the same things that they want Kyler can do in the offense. That said, and we know that when they signed him for when he came out of the Canadian League, that there were other suitors. They paid him some guaranteed money last year, and so it makes sense that they wouldn't want to expose him to waivers. They could always bring up, like, people's like, well, bring up Cam Newton. Okay, well, 1, Cam Newton does not know the offense. 2, if you're in a COVID situation, he's not the one who you can rely on technically right now. 3, he can't sign with the team for 5 days. Like, he's got to go through those rigorous protocols for COVID clearance, and so it's not that simple. And so I personally thought that they wouldn't be able to keep a third quarterback on the roster with other positions, but they clearly thought differently. And Cliff Kingsbury said on Wednesday that Streveler earned a spot on the roster. Running back, they kept all 4 guys that, everyone talked about. So they got Chase Edmonds, James Conner, Eno Benjamin, Jonathan Ward. I kind of thought that was going to be a lock in either way. They don't have anyone at running back on the practice squad, so it'll just be a case of how many are active on game day, whether they go with 3 or 4, and I think they'll have a role probably for all 4.
Yeah, and I think that their plan is to use all 4. Eno's probably going to get some work in the return game. Ward's been used in other situations along special teams, and then of course, the expectations with Edmonds and Connor. That's you look at that, and I wouldn't be surprised if Eno is the pseudo third running back, but yeah. We know that that's not going to get much.
No, we're talking reps. 3 or 4 snaps a game. But, last year, even though when Eno was inactive all 16 games last year, the Cardinals practically always had 4 running backs active because they would elevate DJ Foster from the practice squad for special teams. And so, at minimum, what you look at is that you've got your 2 guys that are going to play on offense, Eno, who's now is able to do things on special teams, and Jonathan Ward, who is a core special teamer, kind of in the role that DJ Foster had last year. So nothing really surprising there, in my opinion. But
and Ward, like you said, Ward basically is filling that DJ Foster role. I would think.
Yeah, it makes sense, and he does. It's kind of interesting because the 2 backups are in many ways they mirror their starters with Edmonds, because Eno's a little more Edmonds-like in his running style and his receiving ability, and Jonathan Ward gives you a little more James Conner. He's bigger. Actually, honestly, he reminds me a lot of Kenyon Drake in the way he runs, the way he plays. Because Drake did have top end speed. That's one thing that was really overlooked about Drake in the last couple of seasons, is that he had top end speed. He just, the way he ran last year, didn't notice it. But boy, that guy's fast, and Ward has top speed too, as well.
It's just they're not bursty.
No.
If that makes sense. They take a second to get to top speed, and that was always kind of Kenyon Drake's thing, is that if he got in past the linebackers, it was really hard.
You could catch him.
To catch him. The problem was he rarely got past the defensive line, let alone the linebacker.
Yeah, that 80-yard touchdown run he had a year ago, he was clocked as one of the fastest players in the NFL last year. Who knew? But wide receiver, they kept 6. And I would say probably, which was the first surprise for me, was to see Keyshawn Johnson cut. Not because I thought I just felt that the kind of the known commodity that Keyshawn was, they were going to keep. And the way they were using him in the preseason, he was getting first team reps. He was the one starting when the other receivers were sitting. I thought, okay, he and Andy Isabella were a lock. I thought Andy, earlier in the offseason, was a little expendable. But, the more I listened to people who have kind of a pulse on the team organizationally, Andy was never in danger of losing his roster spot. So, Keyshawn surprised me a little. Did it surprise you much when you saw that he was among those first cuts? Because that's the thing, is he wasn't even among final cuts. They were ready to move on.
No, and that was the thing, is you and I have talked about this off the air, and Keyshawn's biggest issue was always his athleticism.
Well, as good as his hands were supposed to be, the one thing he never did is make contested catches.
Right. And that's the big thing, is that if you're a 4-6 guy, you better catch everything. And so you can't you can't be a 4-6 guy and then not catch everything. And like you said, he's struggling to get open, struggling to catch contested catches. Look, I like Keyshawn. You like Keyshawn. This is not an indictment of them, but at the same time, Justin and I talk about this all the time on the podcast. Guys that are between 5'11" and 6'2", between 195 and 210 pounds, that do not run sub 4.45 are all what we call jag guys. They're jag receivers in the sense of there's dozens of them everywhere. And so they've got to have something unique about them that gives them an advantage. And he just didn't have that ever came up. Like
here's the thing. He would always look good in practice. He looked good in practices and training camp. He even, I will say that there were a couple of games there were progress made. Like he'd make a catch and got yards after the catch. But here's the thing. Instead of Keyshawn, the guy that they kept on the roster was Antoine Wesley, a guy who I don't know if he had a catch in the preseason. He almost made a fantastic catch on the sideline, but it was ruled not a catch. But he's a former Texas Tech guy who was coached by Cliff Kingsbury in college, 6'7", and so he has an element that no one else, AJ Green to some extent, because he's got the length there, but no one else in that room has. Greg Dortch did really well and really shown in the preseason. But if you were going to keep Greg Dortch and Rondale Moore and Andy Isabella, you basically have three identical body types of short, quick, and fast. And that, it seems like a little bit of redundancy on the roster in terms of what you got. Well, you got Wesley. I don't know how much he'll play, but when they drafted Hakeem Butler a couple of years ago, that's kind of what they were going for. And I don't know if he's going to develop into that, but he does give you some length at the sideline.
Right, and he might be that Dan Arnold replacement type in the red zone, right? So Wesley made sense in that way. And all of them made sense in the end. We talked about it. They were never cutting Andy. We try to tell people that.
Yeah, and there were times when I thought, look, maybe. But then when you've heard Cliff Kingsbury now talk twice, he said, Andy and Rondell do different things. And now, Andy, which is, it's not one you want to hear about your second rounder, but he's got some inside-outside versatility. He's got great long speed. He can do a little bit of returns and punt gunner. I'm like, that's nice. But ultimately, he got probably overdrafted. But he still adds something to the team. And it was important to say that Andy is long speed. He is not quick twitch. And I think they tried to use him more so how they used him last year is how they're going to use Rondale Moore this year. Only Rondale Moore is going to be better at it because he's much better, much quicker in traffic and in space, and the way he runs. He not only has top end speed, Rondale Moore, but he also has elite quickness as well.
Correct, and that's the difference is he has that lateral agility, more similar to what we see with running backs than like you said, the long speed of Andy Isabella. And we've talked about it. Isabella was kind of miscast from the beginning because they wanted to use him as that quick slot receiver, and while he has good quickness, he's more, like you said, he's more of a true downfield burner type, and that's what he's got to work on.
Yeah. At tight end, they go with three guys. They got Max Williams and Darrell Daniels and Demetrius Harris. I personally didn't see that as a surprise at all. Some would probably, if you're a fan, I can see where you'd say that Darrell Daniels has no business being on the roster. They like Darrell Daniels, okay? They know what he's about. He's got some speed and some length. He's not great at any one thing, but he can do several things. He plays special teams, but he's clearly a guy that they rely on. I felt Ross Travis, I think, had a shot at that third tight end spot until they brought in Harris and Cliff Kingsbury. And Kingsbury, on like two different occasions, liked what Harris brings to the room, which is interesting because he has the size and the build of someone who should be an elite pass catcher but has terrible hands. That said, he's been playing for a long time and he's an able and willing blocker. I don't think he's at the same level as Max Williams when he's healthy, but he's an able blocker as well. So I think he gives you that element as well.
Yeah, and that's what it's all about. You look at Darrell Daniels, and we've talked about Darrell before. He is a prototype third tight end that's having to play as a tight end two.
Who's probably not going to be a tight end two for very long once Harris is acclimated to the system, honestly.
Right, and maybe that's what it is. And that's what I've said. Like, people get irritated with certain things and they get frustrated with things, but at the end of the day, the reality is that you can only address so many positions at a time. And whether we agree with it or not, they've addressed certain positions more than once, and it's worked out. And one of the positions that they've unfortunately been unable to address is the tight end position. So they've made do with what they had, and that's the way you have to look at it. And that's the reality of why Darrell Daniels is still on the roster and continues to be, because he's a serviceable tight end too.
Absolutely. The offensive line, technically right now, is only 8, but if you include Justin Pugh, who is on the COVID list and is expected to come off probably and hopefully at the end of this week, they will have the 9 players that I think we both thought were going to be there. You've got your starting offensive line, then you've got your backups, you got Josh Jones, you got Justin Murray, you've got Max Garcia, and then you've got Josh Miles. I felt all 9 of those players were locks to begin with because it addresses everywhere that you need on the line. They do like the upside of Josh Miles. And the other offensive linemen that they had on the roster
were awful.
None of them did anything for they do, like, I will say. So they will talk a little bit about practice squad later. But Coda Martin, you're not going to hear much about him, but it's now the second year in the role they've got him on the practice squad. So if there's something that you can look into, think of a guy like John Wetzel that they had, who ended up being a very handy guy on the roster. Keep an eye on Coda Martin for later this year, next year, into the role that he can build into. But I think he's a guy that they kind of like. I don't know how much upside that is, but if he can be John Wetzel-like, I think that'd be kind of fun. But aside that, the guys that are the linemen that are on the roster were always going to be the guys on the roster. It was just a matter of, I guess it came down, would they keep Josh Miles or would they look for another true left tackle backup elsewhere?
Right. And, we've talked about too, it may end up being that Josh is not the immediate backup, but instead maybe, Josh Jones or Justin Murray end up playing that position. But it was always going to make sense that he is the guy that they're going to continue to develop to maybe be that position and for the future. And I wouldn't be surprised to see something like what they've done with Justin Murray. Maybe not quite as heavy as a contract, but when they find developmental solid backup linemen, they've put the money into keeping those guys. Max Garcia, and like we talked about, Justin Murray. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Josh Miles is another one with Garcia coming up in terms of money next year.
Absolutely. Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web, we will be back to talk about the defense. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. One of the sponsors of the show is DraftKings. You guys know that legal sports betting is coming to Arizona. Daily fantasy is already here. Legal sports betting will be just around the corner. In fact, next week it comes. Imagine how much more fun watching a game when you have some cash on the line. And the best way to get into the action is with DraftKings Sportbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. And so to celebrate, to get this kickoff, DraftKings Sportsbook is giving you a $150 free bet just for signing up. Again, there's no deposit required. This is not like other companies where you have to deposit and they match. This is just $150, no deposit required. If you've been around the daily fantasy game, DraftKings has been one of the biggest leaders in that, but now they've also got the sportsbook to go with it. So download the top-rated DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use the code DRYHEAT when you sign up. Those who sign up right now will receive a $150 free bet to use once mobile bet sports betting hits Arizona. That's the code DRYHEAT and get a $150 free bet instantly. Only at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP. 21 plus, Arizona only. Free bet expires 7 days from date of issuance. Eligibility restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. Subject to regulatory licensing requirements. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, and we've got the defensive side of the ball. And let's start with the defensive line, where it's not a massive surprise, but I consider it a surprise. They kept 7. There were 6 that were going to be locks, absolutely. J.J. Watt, Jordan Phillips, Rashard Lawrence, Lecky Fotu, Zach Allen. And when they signed Corey Peters, you knew he was going to be on the roster. They kept Michael Dogby as well, a guy I've mentioned since the offseason program, a guy who is a potential guy in the roster, but could get caught up in the numbers. In fact, he might be in the exact same situation as he was a year ago. He made the roster initially. After the roster moves, he was the guy that got bumped and spent the year on the practice squad, was elevated a couple of times. We might be in the same situation for him, but good for him. He has developed nicely. I remember when he was drafted, I loved the pick. He's the type of defensive lineman you want on your roster. I don't think he will ever be a star, but if once he gets the opportunity to play, I think you will not be disappointed if he gets the field.
Yeah, and I think the defense is where most of the surprises ended up happening. Wouldn't you agree? I mean,
yeah,
just from not even the names, just the pure numbers that they
absolutely
came away with, and that started out with Dogby making the roster. I think it tells us one of their concerns right now heading into this is clearly going to be the initial health, and this doesn't even involve J.J. Watt, but I think it involves Jordan Phillips. I think it involves Corey Peters. I think it involves
Rashard Lawrence, who now is in his 3rd year in a row with lower body injuries.
Right, and so I think that's I think that's why you keep Dogby along, because I think with the ability of Fotu, Watt, Allen, you've got 3 guys that can really play all over the line, and then Dogby gives you the ability to play one of those, defensive end that they call it positions. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it does make sense as they worry right now about 3 guys. Corey Peters, obviously, you and I were surprised that he's back already. Not a shot at Corey by any means.
No, definitely not.
Just realistic about how fast he came back from that bad injury.
Right. That was not a good knee injury to try and come back from for a man at his size and at his age.
And so I think that when you look at it from that perspective, it makes sense that they keep 6. I think that I guess I'll slightly disagree with you in that I don't think Dogby is one of the first cuts, just because I think, like I said, they got to get through probably at least the Tennessee game with that run heavy offense, with as much defensive line help intact as they possibly can.
That's very possible. An outside linebacker, we have, okay, there were 4 guys that you were new. Once Dennis Gardeck came off of PUP, he became the 4th outside linebacker. Chandler Jones is a lock. Marcus Golden was a lock. Devon Kennard was a lock. His contract's fully guaranteed, unless somehow they found a trade partner. But I'm going to tell you this. Even though he was disappointing last year, Devon Kennard has a lot of fans in this organization for the type of player that he is. I still think that if he gets enough playing time, I believe that the position he is playing is perfect for him. But he was going to make the team. But the 5th guy that made the team was Victor Dimukeje, their 6th round pick. He was one of the kind of unknowns. We failed to mention that Michael Nanette, their 7th round pick out of Penn State, he was among first cuts. He did not look good. They do like some things about him, but thus far they did not bring him back to the practice squad, so they do not see him as a long-term option for the line as of right now. Dimukeje, he makes the roster.
I was trying to be nice about not saying anything, but that, and I know it was a 7th round pick, but just from his on-field performance, he legitimately might be one of the worst draft picks in the Keim era.
Well, and I'll be honest, like when he was drafted, we both were like, why?
Yeah. Well,
he was a guy that you're like, why in the world did you draft that particular guy at that particular position when you could, like, you could have drafted one of a gazillion other super athletic skill positions who could have some upside on special teams at least.
Well, I think, to be honest, the first thing we thought was, why did they draft me? Like,
I will say, yeah. If you look at his headshot, you're like, that dude's that's a high school history teacher coaching on the football team.
Yeah, that's a high school history JV football coach. Like that's. And no offense.
And he's like 23 years old. That's just so sad.
No offense to Michael. I didn't want to dog on him too much, but like, man, that's what I'll say. He looked overwhelmed by the NFL experience, just physically speaking.
Absolutely. But Dimukeje makes the team, so he will essentially slide into the role that Kylie Fitz has had the last couple of seasons. Kylie Fitz does make the practice squad. We'll talk more about that. And he was a guy I wondered who would make the team, but after what we saw, the amount of playing time he got in the preseason and the fact that it wasn't too big for him, he didn't. If you look, there was nothing flashy he did, but he has special teams upside. They did use him on special teams, which is what Kylie Fitz did a lot of, and he's kind of if you have to say it, a Walmart version of Marcus Golden. That's not meant to be an insult, but that's the kind of thing there.
Well, and you look at it, we talked about this a little bit, like he has the same type of game that Golden has. The uniqueness of Marcus Golden is something that cannot be overstated. And it's why when you look at and do draft profiles and you look at athletic testing and things like that, that's why a guy like Marcus Golden is an outlier over everything, because his testing metrics, everything wasn't impressive.
Right. And the thing is, if you go back to when he was drafted, they were not looking at tape at Marcus Golden. They were looking at Shane Ray. And every time they watched, that other guy flashed.
Well, and the biggest thing was simply, and it's beyond true, I've never seen a guy that works as relentlessly as Marcus Golden.
Oh my gosh.
And he is that kind of, I mean, everybody raves about JJ Watt's motor, but JJ Watt's obviously one of the most physically gifted players in NFL history as well. Like right. he was that good. When you watch Marcus Golden play, he plays with that same intensity.
Well, that's crazy. They've got two of the guys on that same room because he and Dennis Gardeck are cut out of the same mold, just with different body types.
Right, and so that's the thing, So when we talk about, Dimukeje's kind of a pared down version. The reason he's so pared down is because he just and realistically doesn't have that same motor. And again, that's not a shot at Dimikiji.
No one does.
Yes, it's rare. It's just such a uniqueness of who Golden is. So that's where that comparison comes. It's if you take away the ability to play at 110 miles an hour every play, you would get, Victor Marcus Golden would be similar to Victor Dimikiji.
Absolutely. And an inside linebacker, no surprises there. There wasn't room to make anything else. You've got Zaven Collins, their first-round pick. Isaiah Simmons, their first-round pick a year ago. Jordan Hicks does not get traded, but the way they will use Isaiah Simmons opens the door for Hicks to get significant playing time, which is a huge upgrade. It's a much better option than anybody else. So Tanner Vallejo, very nice option, did some good things on the field. And I know one of the guys on your staff over in the Revenge of the Birds, Walter Mitchell, is a huge Tanner Vallejo fan. He's done some nice things, but if you're going to count on him,
you're probably going to end up disappointed.
You're going to be disappointed probably. He might be able to take that next step, but if you're giving me the choice between Jordan Hicks on the field and Tanner Vallejo in that third role where you're bringing him in to play fewer snaps than years past, and when Isaiah Simmons is moving around to the slot, to safety and space, kind of rushing off the edge, Hicks is the perfect guy to have, and I'm glad that he's still on the roster. And then Zeke Turner, you knew he was going to make the roster. He's a special teams ace. They used a restricted free agent tender on him. And here's a little insight that I liked. This is my football geeky coming out right now, is that if you watch some of the preseason games and the way they used him the same way. They would deploy him in the same role that they would use for Isaiah Simmons. So now they have a quasi, like if you want to say a Walmart version of Walmart Isaiah Simmons, they do. So that way, schematically, if anything happens to Simmons, they don't have to drastically change the game plan. They can use Turner in that role. He doesn't offer the length and he doesn't offer the speed, but he does offer some of those other things because Turner was a defensive back when he played at Washington.
Right. And so one of the things, and we'll get into this a little bit next, but one of the things we've talked about is that they have changed the way that they're processing Isaiah Simmons. And this isn't, I guess we should explain that. It's not in a negative way at all. But in the sense that they aren't viewing him as a strictly inside linebacker, but they're using him as a chess piece in different ways, and that led to, I think, what ended up being those surprising moves on defense that we were not expecting to see.
Which brings us to the cornerback position, where Malcolm Butler's sudden retirement changes things. Now, Robert Alford technically is not part of the 53 because he right now is on the COVID list, but applause to Robert Alford. We get him healthy through the preseason for the first time in 3 seasons. I cannot wait to watch him play because the mentality
he's got 3 years of frustration.
Well, I love the way he plays, the way he competes. There's a juice that it's not the same as Marcus Golden, but he brings a dog mentality on the field. Now, Patrick Peterson, one of the most talented, athletically gifted, just incredible cornerbacks. He does, like, as good as he was, and I don't mean this to be a negative, he didn't have the same dog mentality. I felt like he was just better than guys. Robert Alford scraps, and you notice it in the practice field. Anytime in training camp before he got hurt, every single year, the last 2 years he got hurt, he looked like the best defensive back on the field because he's physical. He is athletically gifted. But I'm glad to see him back, and it's important, especially important now that he can stay healthy. That they got right now, so they got 4 cornerbacks on the roster. Alford will be back, giving them 5, but someone will have to be cut. So they've got Byron Murphy, you've got Marco Wilson, who's now a starter. You've got Tay Gowan, and a guy that, keep an eye on this guy, because Cliff Kingsbury has now, unsolicited, given praises to this kid named Luke Barku, who is athletically looks the part. He is long, he is athletic, and as of right now, he's ahead of Tay Gowan on the depth chart, because Alford obviously is out with COVID, and so the 3 guys in their nickel are Murphy, Wilson, and Barku. Now, I don't think so. Interesting thing about this, Darquist Denard ends up on injured reserve, so he had a leg injury, or a leg injury that was going to keep him out for a while, so he's on injured reserve, done for the year. Daryl Worley didn't look great on the field, but I think the fact that they didn't need to keep a guy like Worley, that was mitigated by the fact that, hey, Marco Wilson is ready to play. That's what he looked like. Marco Wilson, who, famous for the shoe throwing last year in college, who had a fantastic freshman year, but his consistency in college was always a question. And the Cardinals took him believing he has the tools of a first-round cornerback who had consistency issues, and thus far, he's been coached up, and he looks fantastic, and he's ready to play. And this is different than what we saw from Brandon Williams. We talked about this off the air. Is Brandon Williams looked great, but the dude had never played cornerback practically. Wilson has played the quarterback position for a long time, and I think his emergence is why Tay Gowan remains on the roster, because they didn't have to keep another veteran.
Well, and there's a couple of conversations to have. One, Luke Barku is a undrafted guy out of San Diego State. Was a JUCO wide receiver. So one of the things that you'll find about Barku, if he ever gets on the field, was his ball skills are unbelievable. That's just from being a receiver. One of the other things you'll see about Barku, if he ever gets on the field, is that he is still learning how to play his position. I think this is his 4th season playing corner. So, that's one of the things that when you look at it, the reason he doesn't hang around is because it's hard to find a team that has time to develop corners, because, well, they always need corners. And so if you can't produce right away, then maybe you can't play. So maybe this is a blessing in disguise for the Cardinals, is that he's, had to hunt down work, and now he's here, and after kind of cutting his teeth in other places. That's not to say, I'm not trying to say he's going to be great or, a special player.
Let me give you a comp for him in terms of different position. Justin Murray. He has the potential to be a Justin Murray type thing, because he had bounced around like 5 teams in 3 years. And then when they claimed him off of waivers, Steve Keim was almost giddy. And we were like, why? And then we know why. There was some upside there that no one else knew about. And Barku might be the same type of thing.
And then the other thing was on Marco Wilson, and the thing that you have to remember about Marco Wilson was, you mentioned the phenomenal freshman season. He was legitimately their cornerback 1 as it was working through the season. That's how good he was. And then he came back for a second season, sophomore year, didn't have a great start to the year, and then got injured. And then he played last year, coming off that injury, I believe it was. So he's, you guys have heard me for long enough. I don't make excuses in terms of lack of ability and production. But I will say, I always am interested in guys coming off of serious knee injuries. And the fact that Wilson's had, I believe, 2 serious knee injuries. And when I say serious, I mean like ACLs and stuff like that. Like he's had 2 knee injuries, one in high school and one in college. That's the type of guy that, and we've talked about it before, you are able to take a flyer on in round 4 because he's got elite tape that we've actually seen. And now there is, a health question and a concern of, will he ever get back to that physically? Now, again, this is preseason, so you and I have been very excited about what he's done. It doesn't mean that he's there, but
he's going to get tested in week 1. Oh,
right.
Julio Jones, A.J. Brown.
But it sure as heck seems like he is closer to being the freshman year level talent that we saw than he was his 2020 season talent that looked like it didn't belong on the field.
Right. And so that's the position where we anticipate things are going to happen, and things have happened, just not officially yet. But we'll see what happens moving forward. At safety, I don't know if I'd call it the biggest surprise, but it was the position where they were going to have to cut guys that deserve to be on NFL rosters. And so
I think you and I are both surprised at how they came about it.
Yeah, I thought Chris Banjo was a lock for the roster. Okay, he was cut. So if he was cut, I figured Sean Williams would be on the roster. He wasn't. They cut him. James Wiggins probably was going to have to beat out Charles Washington, who was one of their punt gunners, and he didn't. So you've got your 2 starters in Budda Baker and Jalen Thompson, and 2 backups in Deontay Thompson and Charles Washington. Now, for me, the biggest takeaway from this is that good for Deontay. Like, he was a guy, like, if you've been following the show for a while, Seth was super excited about Thompson, and the fact that he was able to beat out some other guys. I thought that Sean Williams, when he was first signed, was kind of saying, okay, he was going to replace Chris Banjo because he was a special teams. He was playing great on special teams, but he'd played as a high-end starter for a while with the Bengals. And so I thought that Banjo was going to become expendable, but they re-signed Banjo. But then they end up getting rid of both. James Wiggins is now on the practice squad along with Chris Banjo, and Sean Williams isn't. But I'm thrilled to see that. Now, I know some people have some theories about the safety position and Isaiah Simmons, and I think that's what you wanted to get into, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's just that when they go into 3, if they need to play 3 safeties, they're going to look at Isaiah. And to your point, leave Hicks on the field, and Isaiah can almost play as a pseudo dime defensive back. So whether he's, a safety or a corner in a sense with matchups, that's how you're looking at him. You're not necessarily looking at him as the linebacker. And that goes to what you're talking about a little bit with if they're going to run Jordan Hicks out there. I don't think you and I are expecting, barring obviously catastrophe with David Collins, I don't think you and I are expecting Jordan Hicks to replace Collins or Simmons, but instead be on the field with all 3 at the same time.
Correct.
And so, and it's not to say that Simmons is, the backup safety or he's, this or that. It's to say that they are going to use Simmons in different places, which meant that they didn't necessarily need as many safeties on the roster. And again, I'm not saying he's going to replace anything, but what he's probably going to do is be that additional safety. So if they were going to play, we saw them do this at times. We've seen them have Jalen, Budda, and Chris Banjo, Deontay, or Charles Washington on the field at the same time. Well, now it might just be Isaiah on that in that spot.
Yeah, but and Deontay, apparently they like what he's doing on special teams enough to keep him on the roster. I know they like what he has to offer on defense as long as he stays healthy. Washington is special teams. I thought they were going to keep 5 simply for the special teams factor. It actually had nothing
I'm
to
with
do.
you 100%.
It had nothing to do with the defense because if Deontay's only to see the field if Buddha or Jalen gets hurt. That comes down to that. So I only thought that they were going to keep 5 because I would figure they wanted 3 of those guys on special teams. So I knew that 2 capable special teamers on that roster weren't going to make the team. I just didn't think it would end up being 3. But and I'm also surprised that Sean Williams didn't make, because he was one of the free agents that they signed and introduced to the media early on, which is when you do that, you anticipate him being part of the team. When they re-signed Banjo, they didn't have a press conference. When they re-signed Chuck Washington, they didn't have a press conference, but they did have a presser for Sean Williams, which means maybe it was because he got hurt. I'm pretty sure at the end of the last preseason game, and they didn't want to risk him getting hurt. I will pulling back the reason, you didn't know NFL teams cannot cut injured players, so you either have to place them on injured reserve or waive them with an injury designation. So if they clear waivers, then they revert to injured reserve. It's a protection for the players so that you can't, at least once you get to this point, you can't be cut and lose your job because of an injury. You do have, financial protection because you go on injured reserve and you continue to get paid. So, and maybe it was just the concern or whatnot, or simply put, maybe Deontay outplayed them, and that's the thing there. Because now the specialists, we knew what they're going to be. They are what they are. Matt Prater, Andy Lee. We don't need Aaron Brewer. They don't have to talk about that. But the practice squad, are there any moves that have surprised you? I'm not surprised by any of the guys that they brought to the practice squad, at least the first 10 that they announced. Anything that was a surprise for you?
I was going to say, I think we have to designate this in 2 ways. So we're recording Wednesday night. We waited an extra night so we could find out about practice squad and waiver claims. Cardinals didn't make any waiver were not awarded any players on waivers. Does not mean they didn't make any claims. It's just that where they were at in the waiver wire process, there's a potential that guys that they wanted did not make it to them as they were, in the middle of the pack. That being said, we look at it, we know the 10 names that they brought back, 9 guys, and then they have the international player exception or exemption in Bernhard Seikovits. So Psycho's back with rookie safety James Wiggins, and then Jace Whitaker, Ross Travis, Coda Martin, Sean Harlow, Kylie Fitz, Greg George, Chris Banjo, and Andre Bacciella. And then allegedly they've signed, because the team hasn't announced it yet, and this is always kind of a gray area, they signed Rasul Douglas, who's a 5th-year cornerback.
But has pretty good starting experience as well.
Yes, exactly. And then there's another tweet out there. These are both from Aaron Wilson, who's a fairly reputable guy. They signed Rondell Carter to the practice squad as well, who's a pass rusher. So I think
there's another corner as well from John Gambadoro, Antonio Hamilton as well.
Okay, so I think if we look at it, the 10 guys we know, I think Banjo, Dortch, Travis, and Wiggins all made a lot of sense. You and I have joked off air. Jace Whitaker, they really like his special teams contributions, but he's just so not good enough to play corner. So if they're keeping guys, he's not one of them, unfortunately. He's the type of guy that gets brought up when there's a special teams injury for one game, those type of things. Basilia,
Bachelia.
I'm semi surprised about.
He's fast. That they are
Yeah,
super intrigued because of he's another one of those little fast guys, and he's made some plays. Like, he's not just fast, he's fast. And
yeah.
so
But to your point, when you talk about the whole situation, you've got Dortch that you've brought back as well, and we both were wondering if he'd even make the team. That's how well he played. But like you said, Baselia is a 4.28 guy. I mean, he is legitimately probably the fastest guy on the roster. Maybe Rondell Moore's as fast as him, but he's legitimately like in that conversation. I was just surprised they kept two guys, wider, kind of small, fast guys like you mentioned. Dortch offers obviously
there's some return upside.
Yeah,
That's kind of been his thing, honestly. He hasn't really flashed as a receiver, but he can do things in the return game.
And then Kylie Fitz, we know he's always
special teams, knows the system.
He'll be the
if there's an injury,
emergency, or a COVID situation, he's the emergency guy that gets deployed on game day. Yeah, and then remember too, and I know we both cover it, but the way practice squad works now is, one, you get 16 players. You can protect a certain amount each week before the game, so they cannot get poached by another organization. But the other thing is now too is that they can be activated on game day before the team announces their inactives. So, and that can happen 2 times per year before then they have to be brought up and signed to the regular season roster.
Yes.
And you can only do that with 2 players. But if, for instance,
here's the thing, what they did last year. So the tight end position, how they did it for like the last half of the year. And this is how they burned through a whole bunch of tight ends. They'd bring a tight end to the practice squad. They'd elevate him. They'd drop him. They elevate him, drop him. Then they cut him. That's as they went through Jordan Thomas, Ian Bunting, some other dude, Seth the Valve.
Yeah.
And that's so they would just keep bringing guys in, elevate them for a couple games, send them back down, then bring in another tight end. And that's how they made the tight end position work through most of last year.
Right. And so you take a look and so like this year, for instance, you could see a Jace Whitaker get brought up a couple times to be a special teams contributor, and maybe like a Tay Gallen's inactive. That's obviously Robert Alford being healthy. And so now you've got, 4 corners still. And like you were talking about earlier. So those are the little sneaky nuances of how they're going to do things to get by this. The Rasul Douglas is an interesting one because he's been really, really bad, and then he was just bad. He was never good. He's had good games, but he was never he never showed up in the way people were hoping to. Now you got to remember about Rasul Douglas, and he's one of a million of these guys. They come out and they're big, 6'2", 210 pounds, and so teams automatically salivate over them, right? Like immediately. Well, 6'2", good hips, like blah, blah, blah. So these guys continually get shots. Again, last year was probably his best year, and it was still when you look at everything. But he's a guy that fits what Vance Joseph likes to do. I don't think he's a guy. I know Aaron Wilson wrote he wouldn't be surprised if he was on the active roster week 1.
Yeah, I doubt that.
The only way I see it is if Alford is still in COVID protocol.
Correct. That would be the only way.
I think he would be a guy that they would inactivate. And you talked about this, but they would inactivate Tay Gowan and then bring Rasul Douglas back on, as onto the active roster because he's got game experience. They don't want to ruin a guy like Tay Gowan.
Well, and the thing with, if I have a comparison to go, this is the Prince Amukamara edition. Prince Amukamara, who has been a very capable starter, even a solid starter at cornerback for much of his career. He was signed to the practice squad last year and just never got moved up because he wasn't there. Now, part of it is you can protect you can hide a veteran there so that they can learn your system. And that's kind of what they did. Prince Amukamara was able to learn the system, but never got elevated. So they're bringing a guy in. You'll see, since he's not on an active roster, you don't have to worry about having him on game day. It allows you to see him in practice, see him pick up the defense, and then if you need him and he's proven he's good enough, and that's honestly, these guys, the Cardinals are hoping to find someone who is good enough. The talent that's out there is not high end. Like, the names that are out there, like Desmond Trufant, he's washed pretty much. Like he's
Well,
you can expect maybe a Drake Kirkpatrick performance, who wasn't bad but certainly wasn't good last year.
Well, and that's the other thing you have to look at, and you have to remember that the outside of quarterback, the two biggest positions that everybody's searching for are corners and offense tackles. And there's a reason that names that we're familiar with get cut, right? Like, because as Jess said, they're not any good anymore. It's not that they weren't good, it's just that they're not good anymore. And so, like, if you look at a name and you go, hey, I know that guy, there's a I would say probably at least a 90% chance that he just doesn't have it anymore. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule. I think one of the big ones the Cardinals hit on, what was it, a couple of years ago, the older guy from
Williams.
Yeah, that ended up going and playing another 2 years in Green Bay and having good seasons. Those things happen every once in a while, but the names that you're going to be familiar with are probably just not even as good as the guys they have on the roster right now.
Coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, let's talk about Malcolm Butler and the situation there. That's coming next on Rise of C-Red. Back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. The Malcolm Butler situation, this thing came out of the blue. I think it blindsided everyone, including the organization, where he stepped away from the team. We don't know what it was, and now he's officially, as of right now, retired. He's on the retired reserve, and so now he can come back. And so he can come back. He can be reinstated to the roster. There's not a problem with that. But my first reaction was, whoa, what happened? What's going on? And I will say, I know where a lot of who give, and I even kind of tweeted about, it's like, oh, cue the organizational whatever, the podcast. What? The Cardinals are a crap franchise and they can't keep players happy. I don't like that. Might have been it. I don't know anything about this situation. We have not been given a single clue. So I am, based on the report that we have, that it's a personal situation, that there is clearly something off the field that has caused Butler to really, that walking away from the NFL and his fully guaranteed contract of more than $3 million, something is bigger than that. And for that, I hope things work out for him. I am not of the opinion that Steve Keim said something, that something happened football related or organizationally, like when Patrick Peterson, he held out for a little bit one off season because of some things that were said by some executive. I don't think it's that, but I don't know that. But the thing is that, wow, and which makes me think, I hope he's okay, and I hope his family's okay, because to walk away from that big, something, walking away from any job is hard to do because it's your job. And to walk away from one that pays that significant amount is also hard.
It is, and it's, it makes things difficult. And, if it's a dispute regarding work, playing time, things of that nature, I will 100% support the Arizona Cardinals and taking all his money. You sign a contract, and if you don't like the way things work, yeah, you have that option, but you also have the option to give up your salary, or giving up your salary is part of the requirement. If you and I know sports are different, but if you and I are unhappy with something at our job and we quit, we don't get our full salary as well. Like,
Nope.
that's just not how it works. And so, and again, I'm not comparing, but in this sense, if that is the reasoning, and I want to put that disclaimer on there, because Jess and I are not saying that's what's happening. We're just saying, if that is the reasoning, the Cardinals need to be aggressive in garnering his money back, because they're doing what they believe is best for the team. And while it may not be best for Malcolm Butler, and they may end up being wrong, they believe it's best for the team, and so that's all that matters. If it's anything truly personal, and again, we don't know, so I'm not going to speculate what personal things it could be, but if it's anything truly personal, or health wise, that does not relate to um, something that can be controlled by him, then I'm all for let guys know that you're basically on their side. You have their back in these situations, and maybe you don't go after anything, or maybe you just say, hey, we're not going to pay you, obviously, but we're not going to go after that signing bonus money that we gave you up front.
Obviously. Now, with that, obviously that leads to the situation there at cornerback. What is your confidence level in the group that they have currently on the roster? Assuming, so this has the caveat that Alford is reinstated to the roster, and you end up with a starting trio of Byron Murphy, Robert Alford, and then Marco Wilson as your third quarterback. What is your confidence level at the position at the moment now?
I think one of the big things that you and I have discussed quite a bit over the last several years is that our confidence in the corners can be tied very strongly to our confidence in the pass rush ability of this team as well. You don't have to have all pro cornerbacks to have a great pass defense, but you do need at least talented cornerbacks or a strong pass rush. If the pass rush is what we hope it is, I'm not really worried. Obviously, I think the biggest worry you have is that two of the three guys that you're quote unquote relying on have injury history and issues.
And one of them being a rookie. So in the
Right.
rookie corner, that can be rough sometimes.
And so, but that being said, for all the, for all the people that have lamented the lack of playing time in rookies, it's funny now that it's an issue when they're going to start Xavier Collins and Marco Wilson together, or potentially, or even if Marco's not starting, he's getting a lot of reps. And now we're hearing that there are those that don't think it's the best way to go. So, it's one of those, and far be it from me to be a Steve Keim, defender. That's Jess's job on this show. But let's be honest, you've got, you're not going to find a ton of talented corners right now on the street, and well, you've got a guy in Marco Wilson that's played really well, and give him a chance to prove you right, I guess, that he's not ready if they're complaining that he shouldn't be starting, before you before you just give up on him being the starter or being one of the potential, top 3 guys.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. And there is the question about this as well, is at the cornerback position. People keep saying who's going to play out. Is Byron Murphy going to play outside? Yes, Byron Murphy is going to play some outside cornerback, but it's not like necessarily what you think. Like, let's make something clear that has been very clear since this offseason. Byron Murphy is a slot cornerback. He's not leaving the field. He is their number 1 corner, so he will be on the field in base packages, which means technically he's an outside corner when there's no third receiver up on the inside. So he will play boundary in base and slide inside in nickel. That's how that's going to go. It's going to be him and Alford outside. Interestingly enough, Malcolm Butler was listed as a starter on the depth chart. He has been cornerback 3. All that means he's a starter, but base packages, it was Alford and Murphy, and Butler coming in, and Murphy would slide inside. So now Marco Wilson will simply take the role that Malcolm Butler had.
And, it's one of those things, too, and let's be completely honest with this. They're getting out of the way the best receiver group that they're probably going to face all season. So, realistically, it can only go up from Julio Jones and A.J. Brown.
So if Marco Wilson has a rough time, he's going up. If he ends up guarding either one of those guys, the rest of the year probably feels a little bit easier.
Right, and I mean that's the thing is you can't unless he just absolutely doesn't belong on the field. I have a hard time being upset about him, being the third corner in this defense. I think it's fine. And at some point you needed to develop a cornerback. Was it ideal the way it panned out or the way it came down? No, obviously not. I mean, I don't think Malcolm Butler planned it this way either. But at the end of the day, you deal with the hand you're dealt. And like you said, the play of Marco made them comfortable enough to put Darqueze Dennard on IR, to cut Daryl Worley, and to let go of the other veteran corner that they had. I can't remember who it was now that we talked about earlier. And so those are, that's saying something to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the Bizarre Cardinals Talk on the Web, we will wrap up the show. Talk about anything that we might think that the Cardinals still need to do, whether it's a cornerback or at other positions. That's coming next on Rise of C-Red. We're back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the Bizarre Cardinals Talk on the Web. What's next? So the Cardinals have almost a practice squad filled. They have the final roster of what it looks like. No one else claimed or anything like that. What do the Cardinals need to do? Let's talk cornerback. Should they trade for someone? Should they try and trade for a guy like Bradley Roby, who has experience in Vance Joseph's system? Should they try and sign one of these older starters? Do you think they need to do that, or is what they've done so far with a guy like Rasul Douglas and Antonio Hamilton, who doesn't really have any starting experience, put on the practice squad to kind of see if they're good enough to move up? Should they stand pat, or should they look for a veteran upgrade or bring back a Drake Kirkpatrick?
I think they stand pat right now. I'm realistically, I'm fine with where they're at the corner position. Obviously, I know there will be fans that disagree and that think that they need to go, sign prime Richard Sherman. And, if you can do that, go ahead. But
too bad that Richard Sherman is not prime anymore.
Right. So, and so that's where I'm at right now. I don't know if there's an obvious upgrade to what they have. And so I'm okay with seeing how this plays out, at least in week 1 and 2. And that's what I said. It's like people will absolutely disagree with me, and they have 100% the right to. But I want to see what this team is before I fall over myself in fear. And I'm not even going to, unless we're talking like a 49 to to 21 beat down where they can't even stop the Tennessee offense. I want to see this team the first 3 weeks, and then after 3 weeks, if they're 0-3 and Trevor Lawrence looked like the second coming of Peyton Manning, then maybe okay, let's see them make a move. But I want to see these guys have a chance to succeed first. That being said, if Alford is hurt, obviously, or something else comes up, I'm fine with it. But I actually kind of think that they'll be fine as long as the pass rush is intact.
That's looking up and down this roster now, like necessarily how I would have put the roster together. Yeah. I can't really think. It doesn't really look like they need to address. Like there's no large need.
No, I think
cornerback. That's the one you're watching, but I don't think there's a single other position where you're going. They need an upgrade because you've got your quarterbacks, you got your running backs, your receiving room's fine. I think now with Demetrius Harris, you like where the tight end room is because now with Max Williams and Demetrius Harris, you can say you have two legitimate NFL tight ends, and you're in a good position there. Your offensive line, you're good. They've got more defensive linemen than I thought they'd have. You've got cornerback is the only question mark for me, and as long as health remains relatively okay, I don't think they need to address any position.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you wanted to address a position, I would be fine with tight end. After that, I mean, I think you are watching the defensive line still with the injury concerns that we have. And we being Jess and I, not the team, but the actual fans looking at it and going, there could be issues. But realistically, I think we're, when you look at it overall, you're very comfortable with where they are as far as the team construction standpoint. And there will be something that comes up that Jess and I are wrong about, but I think right now we need to be proven wrong as opposed to just assuming that the worst and that we're going to be wrong.
Absolutely. And with that wraps up this edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast of SR Cardinals Talk on the Web. We will be back in a week. We'll have some other news to talk about, but more importantly, the Cardinals will be getting ready for a season opener on the road against the Tennessee Titans. What we'll do is we will talk about our expectations for the season and look ahead to that week 1 battle. On behalf of the Rise of C-Red podcast, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. We'll begin back again, like I said, next week. Thanks for listening as always. Go Cardinals.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise up Sea Red.
Rise